Sup, tricksters? Welcome to another episode of Exploring Coding Boundaries with Low-Key Consulting. In this episode, we're going to discuss code quality, which comes back a lot, especially if you've been working in a team or if you're going to be working in a team. If you've seen pull requests, code quality comes up. If you've heard coders talk to each other over beers, code quality comes up. It's a weirdly important topic. The problem with code quality is that the term is incredibly vague, and very often it really depends hugely on personal preference. So I've come up with a model that none of my friends have found a way to falsify yet, and I've been sitting on this for a little bit over a year trying to poke holes in it, and I haven't. So this is my challenge to you. Take this model, try it out, and then tell me, does it work, does it not work? Do you have a better model for code quality? Do you have another way to make this work? It's a very, very simple model. You can see it on the screen. It's CCC over T. Don't worry, that's not the end of the video. I'm going to explain that. Well, CCC over T stands for 4 words. They are correctness, communicability, changeability, and time. In other words, every property of code is going to come down to one of these 4 categories. Actually, it's going to come down to one of the 3 top categories. T is just time because the code base is bound by time. It's going to evolve over time, and so will the measure. But I will talk about this in more detail when we get to it. Let's tackle these things one at a time. Let's talk about what it means for the code to be correct. This is probably the most subtle one, even though from a pure formal perspective, the way we're used to thinking about code, it should be the most obvious one. Because correct means how closely the behavior of the code matches the team's shared understanding of what it was supposed to do. And here, team includes everyone. Team includes the product owner, team includes the designer, team includes the customer or the shareholder. It's not just the dev, and it's not just the tests, and it's not just the specs or whatever you did to get there. And this is really important. It has to be whether everyone agrees that it does the right thing. Lesson 1 here, for instance, the obvious one for me on this one is performance. If we don't care about performance, then maybe it's okay to have an n+1 query in this piece of code. We will talk about this a little bit more in a second when we come back around to time, because I'm not suggesting that an n+1 query is always a good thing. In fact, if you can write the code without it, maybe you might as well. But I'm making a point that will come back when we talk about the evolution of the product and the evolution of the code base. So the next C, the second C after correctness, is communicable. Is the code communicable? What that means is, how easy is it for someone, you in 6 months maybe, or someone new to the code base, to find this code and to figure it out? That's very simple, right? That's just a very, very simple category for the code. It has nothing to do with how correct the code is, and everything to do with how a human will be able to understand this code. Let's move on to the next C. After correct and communicable, we have changeable. What does this mean? Well, how easy is the code to change, right? How easy is it for someone new or you in 6 months to change the code? And again, that has nothing to do with how correct the code is, and that actually doesn't have a ton to do with communicable the way it was defined, because I defined communicable specifically as how easy it is for someone new or for you in 6 months when you've forgotten about it to find the code and to figure it out. Changeable kind of assumes, okay, you figured out the code, now can you change it? So that's the 3 major variables, the 3 major categories for code quality, right? Correctness, communicability, and changeability. So let's talk a tiny bit now about over time. Let's talk a little bit about this. The code is correct today does not mean the code is correct tomorrow, because product descriptions, product purposes, and product needs change. I introduced the example of the n+1 query. An N+1 query is okay if you're a pre-seed stage startup and you're just looking for your customer base and you have 6 people that are using the code base and you have 85 elements in your database. Who cares, right? It's not a big deal. Now let's say you're successful and you have 10,000 customers and you're doing 400 queries every minute and they're dealing with 200,000 elements in the database. You can't have an N+1 query. That's terrible, right? Bad code, bad, sit, no biscuit. So what this would mean is that the correctness of the code, what it may have been the correctness, if you'll forgive the expression, back then is no longer the correctness. The definition of correct has evolved over time. So now we can talk about communicable. Is the code communicable? Well, now we can talk about an important element of what it means to be communicable over time. The members of the team change. What is communicable to some people in the team is not communicable to other members because they have different skill sets, different preferences, different language, different approaches to language. And maybe they have different amount of knowledge as well, right? Maybe some code is particularly readable or communicable, but only if you understand the domain well enough. And maybe that is in fact a barrier we're not willing to go under, right? We're not willing to write dumb code that doesn't represent the domain well because it would be easier to approach for someone new, because then it would actually not be good for someone who's familiar with the domain because they would have to translate back out to something else. Small brands into domain-driven design. But the point here remains for communicability, you get to choose what it means for something to be communicable, and communicability over time does evolve as well. So now let's talk about changeable. Changeability over time. Again, as the product evolves, the code may or may not be changeable over time. And that may or may not be a problem. In one of the companies I worked at, I was tasked with looking at a particularly critical piece of code because it had to do with fraud management. And it took me 5 hours to properly parse out what the code did. And the reason why is because it was very simple looking code that basically tacked together the results of Boolean operations. Said this is true and this is true and this is true and this. And then occasionally there were conditional clauses. If this is true and this is true, then maybe you should do this conditional with this other conditional and this Boolean with this other Boolean. And so it was actually a very, very long, very, very complicated operation that ended with true or false. And we had to track all the possible ways through this. And the reason I had to do that was because we had someone whose job it was to actually manage the fraud line, like where we decided that it was an acceptable amount of risk for the company. But they could not do that if they did not understand what the software actually did in order to make proper, intelligent decisions about it. And then it took me 16 hours of 8 2-hour meetings with this person to explain all of it. And not because that person was dumb, they weren't. That this person was very smart, they were competent, they knew their field. In fact, one of the reasons it took so long was because they asked very pointed, very specific questions. And often it made me re-understand the code because I realized that something which I assumed at a particular meeting had a different meaning that they understood better than I did because they were the fraud expert and I wasn't. So the code here was absolutely not changeable. That piece of code had been around for 3 years, I think, and had not been touched. And here's the important bit. For 3 years, it did not need to be changeable at all. It did not really need to be communicable at all. What it did need to be was correct. At some point, over time, we forgot what correct was, so we had to reestablish that, and then we had to figure out what the new correct for the product was. So, okay, let's sum up a little bit. Code quality is correct, communicable, changeable code over time because the definition changes. So how could you use this as a team? Well, here's the important thing. You need to define a number or whatever it is that you want to assess for how important it is to match any of these things at a given time. These are all team and product specific, right? The code may not actually need to be very high on the correctness scale if you're trying out a whole bunch of things or for any number of other reasons. It may not need to be very communicable, especially if you're the only person on the team, or if there's three of you and you all know each other very well and you don't sleep because you're, again, in a startup or you're doing a lot of work, or this one thing is the only thing you're all working on, so you all have the context in your minds. That could be a reason why it doesn't have to be communicable. It may not need to be changeable if you're not going to touch it again. If you're going to write this one thing and then it's going to solve the problem and then you're going to be done, then you don't have to be high on changeability. So here's how you use it. If someone writes code and offers a pull request that you have to review, and it is highly changeable code, but it doesn't need to be, you can just say, this code is too high on the changeability scale. If the code is, I don't know how this is possible from my own personal biases, but if it's too high on communicability, you could say, okay, look, your variable names don't need to be three lines long. You can just have an X here because in the context, this X has to be this one thing. That's all it can be. So you're good. It's fine. You can write element if you want, or, clothe, or whatever it is, dress, I don't know, whatever it is you're working on in this method. Correctness probably has to be high, but again, it's important to note this is the correctness that the team really needs and understands. And so you don't have to be a major stickler for correctness because your standard for correctness is higher than everybody else's in the team. The only reason you would have to do that is if you know that the lack of correctness is going to lead you into trouble in the future. You as a team, not you as a person. So, fellow tricksters, code quality, CCC over T. Correct, communicable, changeable, over time. Cool? Cool. Hey tricksters, thanks for watching. If you like this, smash that like, subscribe, and consider donating so I can keep making content for you. See you all next time.